Hello there and welcome to The Value of Everything. Today I've got a guest with me, which is probably the second time. Firstly was one of my close friends, and now I actually have somebody who is in the sphere of debate and has a political ideology. The person is a Marxist theoretician, and his main focus is on theories of revolution, a model of communist political economy, and he is a working class activist. You can catch him at WordPress website at the moment called commonruin.wordpress.com. His name is Michael Acuña. Welcome to the show.
All right. Thank you so much, Charles. I'm happy to be here.
So thank you very much. That was very hard for me to perform there just first thing in the morning, but I'm pleased that we've got our introduction out of the way. So we'll just keep it fairly the same tone as that we just started it. I won't keep it as formal as that throughout the course. So just to say that Michael was kind enough to contact me. I initially went out to one of your colleagues, and I made a few comments on his blog quite some time ago. He came back to me and was thinking about doing a podcast in the future. I don't think he had the time, but Michael, you got in contact with me, so I'm very pleased to say that we can do these debates. So just basically, Michael and I came to an agreement that we wanted to do a series of debates where we just try to work on the logic. We won't try and go too extreme or start shouting at each other, but we're just going to work on the logic and see where it takes us. If we find ourselves in a position where we don't necessarily agree, we're not going to apply pressure on each other and stranglehold each other. We're just going to let the other person go away, find more information, come back and add it to another series. But hopefully we can just try and work together and create a good collection of episodes which I give people good ideas of political ideology, and probably, if just to quote probably Karl Marx, is to give an idea of how to change the world, which I'm very interested in, and I guess you are, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do think that through debate, the primary objective, at least on my end, is never to win an argument necessarily, but rather to just progress in terms of intellectual cultivation. I mean, most of my views were formed in the course of debating with other people, and I learn a lot in the process. So I'm sure we can keep things civil, and I have no intention of trying to force you to my perspective or what have you.
Excellent. Okay, so so just so that we're not straightly cutting into the meat and bones of everything, we're going to go and just do areas that we're probably, I would imagine, that we're in agreements with a little bit more than anything else, which is where we are headed. However, before we go any further, I think we probably need to start with definitions. So would you mind explaining your ideology? Because obviously, even me mentioning Marxist, a lot of people, just total beginners, wouldn't be quite sure of what that means and stuff. So could you explain your side, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I begin, I should probably mention that the term ideology itself, in the Marxist tradition, has a very specific meaning. And it probably doesn't correspond to what ordinary usage of the term is.
Sure.
But nonetheless, when you, for the purposes of our dialogue, when you say ideology, I'm just going to interpret it as political philosophy.
Yep.
And we'll just ignore the Marxist use of the term.
Sure.
Since as you mentioned in the introduction, I am a Marxist. Basically, what that means is I adhere to the method of socioeconomic analysis that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed. Basically, my views correspond fairly closely to their own. I'm not a Leninist. I consider myself a Marxist in the classical sense. But I also share certain facets of commonality with very early anarchists, particularly Bakunin. So there are elements that I sort of incorporated of his political philosophy into my own. But Marxism, a lot of people are under the misconception that Marxism is a sort of communism, or it's a sort of economic model. And it's really not that. It's just a method of analysis. One could hypothetically be a Marxist, and in the sense they analyze the workings of capital and yet remain committed to some model of capitalism. So I am a Marxist, but my political philosophy is council communism. And that's a very specific theory of revolution and a basic model of communist political economy. And it's basically, it's grounded in social ownership and worker control of the means of production.
Gotcha.
So it's distinct from state socialism, what a lot of people associate 20th century socialism with. It's more in the libertarian end of things.
Okay, I think we've already started, and we're probably on agreements on a lot of things here. But I'm sure we're going to find something that we're not quite in agreements on. But yeah, sorry, did you want to expand on anything else on that?
No, I think that pretty much covers all the bases in terms of where I stand.
Excellent. Okay, yeah. So from my side, let me just, I'll just explain just from where I started. Probably I got a little bit interested in politics from, what shall we say, maybe even like early teenage years, and I would watch the news and I would watch like Parliament and things like that. I was a little bit of a weirdo like that. I don't know why I got obsessed, but I think I just saw it as a little bit of a soap opera, and I found it fairly interesting. And then as time progressed, I think even just my own little mind just working, I didn't have any idea of all the powerhouses of political theory in the background. I sort of think I came to a conclusion of a technological sort of government who literally made all decisions based upon science and the best way to do things. And I thought that maybe why is everybody doing all this kind of stuff? Everyone should be like leading towards like this scientific revolution where what is the best thing for mankind, and thinking on a collective basis. Now, as time progressed, I started to get a little bit more information, and then I was like, okay, well, we've got the power issue. And even though my intentions might have been very good to create a beautiful world, with the scientific method being the forefront and the Enlightenment and things like that, maybe my choice wouldn't have been better for everyone else. And that's where I started to really go a little bit more extreme into individual rights and thinking how we can create a world in which people can make choices and have voluntary exchanges. After that, I've come into technology's come back into the fray a little bit more now, and I'm very interested in the adoption of things like cryptography and the blockchain, where potentially there could be some kind of syndicate where people voluntarily enter into it's like a crowdfunding situation where you enter into a system which potentially runs on an autonomous level for the social good of people. And then when there is surplus in supply, that distributes back into charity. However, there is a hard code surrounding that. It's very like, you literally have to have a whole session for me to explain that. I've done a few little weird podcasts in the background beforehand, but I guess I'm a little bit of a very strange political stance, because I adapt the blockchain a lot with my theories. So that's where we can go a little bit crazy at times. But I guess on the fundamental side, it does get encapsulated in a capitalist's psyche, because it is a value system where money is exchanged, and I go a little bit further to create not just money, but money with values of moral good. and that is in exchange in a system of choice. But then we probably have got, I think probably one of the areas where Michael and I probably might cross over a little bit is probably property and land and things like that, because there's issues on those terms between us. But I think that's, did I define myself well? Would you like any other information from my side, Michael?
No, I think I understand where you're coming from. In fact, it's interesting you should mention having a background in technocracy, as it were. I had a very similar perspective when I first started getting interested in political theory when I was a teenager, like yourself. I was very pessimistic about human potential for a long time. I thought that the segment of the population that had the capability to make informed, good decisions was rather small in relative terms, and that democracy, individual freedom, things of that sort were sort of hindering progress. And for a few years when I was younger, I entertained very authoritarian notions of socialism.
Yep.
I was convinced that that was the way forward. And it wasn't until I was presented with actual empirical evidence of people making decisions on a very decentralized basis that were rather good, in my opinion. And not only that, but when I was finally confronted with the notion of whether or not an elite should, in a moral sense, be making decisions for other people, it wasn't until I reached that point that I really began to think in more libertarian terms. Again, obviously, as a communist, this is the libertarian left. I don't want to confuse listeners when I use that term.
Yep.
But when I say libertarian, I really just mean decentralized.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting start, really. So can I get more information from your side, just so we have a little bit more of an idea of our stances and stuff?
Of course.
Okay, so say we're up. Sorry, the episode is to go into where we're headed, but I just want to make sure our definitions are very well grounded first. So in your society, how is it sort of structured? How is the control system? How do people make choices and things like that? How does the agency work out?
Okay. So as the very term council communists suggest, things are, in terms of economic organization and political decision-making, are grounded in a series of federated workers' councils. So what you would have in terms of political economy is you would have worker-managed cooperatives that are engaged in production that is, it's planned on a societal level, but it's planned in a decentralized manner. So as opposed to the Soviet model that everyone's familiar with, where you have a central planning agency sending out quotas to state-run factories or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
In this model, what you would have is participatory planning, where consumers and workers come together and they work out a plan. It'll take a while for me to really flesh this out, and I probably should spare all the details for a later date. But just to give you a general sense of it, councils of consumers and workers would agree upon a plan after a series of deliberations. And then after that plan was agreed upon, we would distribute goods and services not based upon the usual criteria that you encounter in capitalism, where you basically use money that you earned, a wage or profits, and if you're a capitalist, and buy goods and services in that sense. But there would be a series of labor vouchers. They don't necessarily have to be equal in terms of the bundle of goods and services they provide each individual, but it would be relatively equal.
Right.
So there is a incentive base. There's an incentive structure in terms of remuneration, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, there's a lot of communists that disagree. There's people who believe in all kinds of different theories of distribution. So this is all just my personal opinion. This is what I believe in.
Sure, yeah. And just when those decisions are made, is it majority rule, unanimous? How's the choice made?
Well, in terms of in the workplace itself, self-management it's not a strict method of decision making in terms of whether it emphasizes majority rule or consensus decision making. Instead, self-management is based upon the principle of excuse me.
That's right.
It's based upon the principle of people having the right to participate in decisions to the extent and the degree they're affected by the outcomes. So in some instances, it would be a matter of majority rule. In other instances, it would be consensus decision making. But there's not any one hard and fast method for decision making.
So it'll be,
but it is grounded in that principle. I could give you examples if you like. So let's say we're in a workplace and I have my own office, and I have a picture of my family on the desk.
Yep.
My coworkers wouldn't be able to go in and say, well, that picture offends me for whatever reason, because they're not affected by it. They're not looking at it. I am. So I would have unilateral decision making in those terms.
Right.
Now, if it had to do with something that affected everyone, like if one of my coworkers decided to play a radio in his office very loudly and it affected me if I could hear it, then I would have a right to intervene and, along with whatever other coworkers were affected, say, no, you can't do that. You're interfering with us. We don't want to hear that.
Because it interferes with the production.
Correct. And we're affected by it personally. Now, someone down the hall, maybe they wouldn't hear it. They wouldn't have a right to participate in that decision. So it's a very flexible model of decision making, but it is grounded in the principle that you do have a right to decide upon decisions that affect you in the degree in which they affect you.
And is there any arbitrary person, any person that has judgment, passes judgment, anything like that in that situation?
No, there wouldn't be someone who could just arbitrarily come in and interject their views, or there isn't someone who has ultimate decision-making authority. Again, it would have to be grounded in that principle of democracy, of self-management that I had mentioned.
Okay, and the thing is, obviously, say a worker has got the choice to leave their position if they want to that day, and they can return to another position or something like that. Is that right?
Well, I think that might be a little too much. So I think that there would still be a contractual obligation. Say if you applied for work at a collective and you were hired by that collective, you would be obliged to stay in that role for the degree to which your contract specified. So if you agreed to work there a year, say, you couldn't just leave and come back. You could quit at any time if you wanted to, but you couldn't just come back and start work, if I understand your example correctly.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, Mike, I just wanted to get a little bit more of the meat and bones there of your definition, but that was great. Thank you for that, Michael.
Oh, it's no problem.
So, the topic today is where we are headed. So, I think there was like a few categories that we was going to cover. Where would you like to start?
Well, I guess I wanted to preface things by mentioning when I talk about the future, I hate to interject with all of these these clarifications, but there is a misconception that Marxists are something of economic determinists,
right? So
that we think that there's a very clear teleological path that's determined by the material basis of society, and we can make predictions based off of that. I'm not an economic determinist. I personally, when it comes to the theory of history I subscribe to and the sociology that I apply, I do consider myself advocate of the materialist conception of history, but I'm something of a compatibilist. So I don't think that the future is already determined. I think that there's several possible courses that might happen. So when we get into the minutia of this, my predictions are very tentative. I'm not that confident in them. Yep. I don't think anyone can really say what's going to happen, but I will give you my honest opinions as to what I think is likely.
But you obviously you wouldn't be doing this unless you thought that people have agency on how to control the future.
Right, I do. Yeah. I think that I do believe that agency matters. I don't think that these things are determined in any sense in a strong way, but I do believe that people, they're acting within parameters that are set up by history, by the economy that they live in. So I do believe there are certain constricting factors to the decisions we make at any given time. So I'm not a voluntarist sociologically. I don't think we can just do anything.
Yep.
There are constraints. But yeah, I do believe that agency matters and that affects the outcome of history.
Okay. All right. I think probably Marxists are probably one of the better areas and the better political thoughts to predict the future. That's why I thought it was a good topic to cover. Would you, so currently with the situation that we've got a massive amount of debt which is floating around the system. This really isn't going to be paid off without destroying the spending power or the purchasing power of the currency. So I think there's a certain trajectory which is happening right now. How is all this setup what is it gonna create? What is the next step, would you say?
Well, as a Marxist and as someone who believes that the current economic crisis that's affecting the global economy is grounded fundamentally in a declining rate of profit, I think the only way to get out of this is to basically have massive capital destruction, by which I mean letting businesses fail, writing off outstanding debts, bankruptcies. All of this needs to happen. What's been occurring lately, the reason why public debts are out of control is because basically governments have been implementing Keynesian programs to try to stimulate the economy, because private investors they don't have any confidence right now, and they shouldn't, because they're not getting decent rates of return on their investment. So in those instances, governments step in and they try to stimulate through deficit spending. The theory is that eventually, since consumers will be spending money and banks will be lending, the theory is that will sort of reinvigorate capitalist investment confidence.
Yep.
That's not happening. I don't suspect it will happen. I don't know. I know that it's politically dangerous to allow the level of capital destruction necessary to sort of reset the system. Because a lot of people are going to be unemployed. A lot of people are going to lose money on investments. It's very dangerous. That's why governments have a tendency to implement Keynesianism. It's in their interest. They're trying to maintain some stability in the system.
Do you sometimes like the analogy I'd like to make it is like, you know, where say like the system like of capitalism, it sort of scalps off like the cream of society sort of thing. But it almost like eats its own self until there's literally nothing left and the cupboard's bare, and then you're eating your own tail sort of thing. It's sort of like that system, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think part of the problem, it's interesting because this is one area where classical Marxists and Austrian school right-wing economists are in some level of agreement. The theory of crisis we subscribe to differ fundamentally, and Marxists are saying that this is the outcome of the internal contradictions of capital, that there's a falling rate of profit endemic in the capitalist system that recurs periodically. Austrian school theorists believe that this is the outcome of artificially low interest rates that the central bank has set, which results in irresponsible lending and unviable businesses being set up, and that you basically just need to let those businesses fail, and it'll be a very short crisis, and we can get back if we let the market sort of clear those inefficient firms out. So yep. we disagree on. I don't know if you subscribe to the Austrian school theory of crisis, but those who do, Marxists disagree with them on the cause of crisis, but we're in agreement about the solution. You do need to let those businesses fail because government is not going to be able to stimulate its way out of this problem.
Sure, because there's a certain amount of basically what's happening right now is debt slavery, where more debt's being thrown into the system. People need to use credit cards. People are stuck in this track of consumerism, and they need to get this massive, expensive house to keep up with the Joneses. So it's a system that doesn't really help with the human good.
No, it doesn't. And part of the problem is, in terms of debt in particular, is capitalist ideology is such that it sort of in the last 50 years legitimated itself on this notion of a middle class where most people should fall within this particular income range, and that income should be able to provide you with a house of your own, 2 cars, college education for your kids. And people have those expectations, and if they're not meeting them, they're willing to go into massive amounts of debt to maintain that sort of standard of living. Because if they don't, they feel that they failed. They're not living the in my case, the American dream.
And do you feel like some people just take on debt and they don't necessarily think about the consequences, the slavery that could potentially occur from this?
Oh yeah, they're not thinking of those broader implications. And that has to do also with conspicuous consumption, that we live in a society that values instant gratification. Yeah. And that's another issue. In my opinion, that's another contradiction of capitalism, because on the one hand, you have all of these advertising firms trying to instill in people this notion that they have to buy the latest commodity, they have to maintain appearances, otherwise they're viewed as losers in society. But on the other hand, you get into private debt, and that's destabilizing to the system, because once you accrue too much of that on a national scale, you have a problem.
Yep, absolutely. Michael, I actually went through one of your posts, I believe. You made a really good observation, actually, perfectly in line with the topic of today. I think you made a 5-point piece about political elite in North America and the European Union to remain steadfast, determined to a force of proletariat to bear the cost of the economic crisis, which I think we've pretty much covered there. You mentioned that the housing market. Sorry, this is probably a little bit in the past, wasn't it? When was this posted?
I think that was posted in 2014.
I still think it's pretty. I think it's pretty valid, actually. A lot of these points that you've made, which is quite good. So housing stocks, for the most part, would go on an upward trajectory. Would you say that's getting a little bit rocky now at the moment? Because there's a little bit of price problems in the market with that.
Yeah, this varies a lot on a national scale.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, we had a property bubble that burst in 2008, where basically we were building so many homes because banks were issuing these subprime mortgages to people.
Yep.
And so the supply started to exceed the real demand. And by which I mean the demand of individuals who could actually afford these houses.
Yeah.
So we had a bubble that popped into around 2008, and property values plummeted. We've seen that sort of recover, and the reason we've witnessed that is because the federal government started guaranteeing all loans that banks issued for purposes of buying homes. So banks right now aren't lending that much in terms of business ideas, entrepreneurial ventures, but they still are issuing mortgages because they have that insurance from the federal government. And so that has sort of helped rebound house prices.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in essence, you find that as the management of these massive corporations, they're trying to really minimize costs, so they're outsourcing all of their workers to different regions where people are even more exploited than people are in America. And then you're finding that the actual workers who used to be able to purchase all of these beautiful goods now can no longer do that. So it starts to defeat the whole purpose of their production. So then these corporate managers start to think, okay, so how can we cut costs even further? So the quality of that worker in itself gets diminished. They have to produce more with less time, so that the pressure is like the throttle is really being pushed harder and harder as we get into this stage, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I was just sorry, I'm sort of glance reading your comments while because I think you made some other good comments as well. A combination of increased supply of labor and a decreased demand of the tech industry.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, could you expand on that just so I don't want to paraphrase you? Yeah.
So in the United States, and I'm sure you get that in Australia as well, and in Europe, they've surely been hearing this. There's a lot of emphasis on the tech sector, Silicon Valley.
Yep.
I have family that lives near Silicon Valley that works there. I briefly lived in the area. There's a lot of commentators that think that that's the future of capitalist development, is the tech sector. And in some ways, they're right. I mean, obviously, if we're discussing engineering, say, of machines, that's always been a fundamental aspect of any economic development. That's essential.
Yep.
But when we're discussing Silicon Valley, a lot of this is based upon intellectual property rights that are very difficult to enforce, and advertising, because as profitable as Google is, it's entirely dependent upon advertising revenue. All of that takes place in the real economy, by which I mean the manufacture of goods and services. So if that part of the economy takes a hit, necessarily Silicon Valley will also, because they are dependent upon that ad revenue.
Sure.
I'm not discussing the manufacture of, physical computers or software or any of those things. When I mentioned that, I meant specifically internet-based firms. And I still believe, even though it didn't happen in the timeline I had predicted when I wrote that post, I still believe that since the fundamentals of the economy are still very weak, and I believe another big crash is on the horizon, that Silicon Valley is going to experience that exodus of labor power, because there's just too many people that are getting degrees in that field. And once the real economy takes a hit, they're not going to need that number of people proficient in software development or web development or what have you.
Okay.
So you'll see a corresponding drop in property prices.
Can I just expand on one area of yours, because I'm going to probably I'm trying to encapsulate it into the Marxist model. So
Sure.
basically, people become very compartmentalized with their means of production. So they do a very isolated role, like, I don't know, artwork or something like that, but never get quite the broad picture of what's going on. So therefore, their skills are reducing, and then because it's turning into a production line of the tech industry. And eventually, once they leave the workforce, they find that they're really unskilled. They're almost like an unskilled worker, and they can't really return to the work because they don't have the holistic approach of how to start up your own business, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. I think that, even Adam Smith made that observation when he was discussing the division of labor.
Yeah.
Eventually you become so specialized that you don't develop any other aspects of your human capabilities. And as such, you're handicapped if you become redundant.
Yeah.
And that's what happens, not only because of economic crises, but also because of revolutions in technology. Eventually, the line of labor you're involved in is going to transform in some sense. And that particular skill that you cultivated is not going to be valued any longer, in which case you're lost. And that causes, displacement and a lot of issues for individual workers.
Sure, yeah. I've always found that, yeah, like the industries that I've worked into, this does happen all the time, and you literally have to fight it to just have a broad sense of what's going on in the world. You've literally just got to take the time outside of work to have a bigger understanding, get the bigger picture, and that's by far the most interesting area, and it is probably the best for your own production capacities to actually understand the big picture. Because once you gain pieces of information, then you piece the jigsaw together, then you get a better idea of how to approach a problem and create solutions.
Oh yeah, it's definitely empowering if you can do that. But that's also one of the reasons I'm a materialist, in that I don't believe that most people in society are going to take those steps to inform themselves and to develop this sort of holistic thinking, because they're not incentivized to.
Yes.
If you're able to reproduce your daily life with relative ease, which under ordinary circumstances you are in capitalism, at least as it's developed in the last 50 years, you're not going to feel the urge to really try to understand. A lot of people think, for instance, that this is how things have always been. They sort of naturalize these phenomena. And therefore, they don't even understand that capitalism is a mode of production, that it's organized in a particular way. They take everything for granted.
And you get yourself into a situation where you go, okay, well, work 5 days a week, that's a load of crap. But once it gets the weekend, we'll hit hedonism. I'll turn into a consumer. I'll take drugs. I'll do all of this kind of stuff. And then back to the grind of Monday morning again.
Yeah, exactly. It's the trade-off. And that's what capitalism is based upon. Its conception of the good life is consuming. People don't think about the production process because that's sort of just de facto taken as what they call in neoclassical economics, a disutility, that it's something that is regrettable, but it's necessary that you can so that you can consume on the weekend, as you said.
Yeah. Okay, so just to bring us back, just a couple of other things, because I think one of the areas that we wanted to cover as well is this turn of extremism, and I think you've made this in the second point of this article about this continued expansion and the left's inability to organise the working class people. Now, what's your opinion of like Bernie Sanders and like Donald Trump? You've got these extreme areas of society where people just don't think that they're getting a voice now because of this political elite. So now they're just turning to the most extreme parts of society. Would you say that maybe that point has changed a bit recently, where people are going for the extreme parts of society?
I mean, in that post, I make the prediction that fascist parties are going to be able to capitalize on the sort of growing discontent that's palpable among the masses.
Sure.
And the reason I think that is because the left, as it's currently constituted, is completely inept. And it has allowed itself to be diverted into areas of life that are sort of, they're fringe and they're alienating, and it doesn't connect to ordinary working people. In other words, they sort of, they've distanced themselves from the scientific socialism that Marx had pioneered, where he was emphasizing that if you're interested in achieving a different mode of production, you have to emphasize the class struggle above all else. And when you look at the left today, especially in Europe, you see them fighting for immigrant rights. You see them engaging in all of the culture wars. All of that is irrelevant to what Marx had pointed out, which is why I think we need to return to those principles.
Why do you think sorry to interject there. Why do you think that happens? Why are they just like misguided now?
There's a lot of things that happened since the 1960s when the New Left emerged, and I don't like to engage in conspiratorial thinking, but there is actual evidence of certain thought leaders on the New Left, such as Marcuse and other characters in the Frankfurt School. They actually worked with the American State Department during the Second World War. They were psychoanalyzing Hitler and his motives, and that's all fine. But the cynical part of me thinks that after they left the State Department and started returning to academia and doing their own research, some of these figures, especially Marcuse, his views were so fringe and alienating to working people that the government and they did this with postmodernism as well. They put a lot of money into those things, getting them to become in vogue on college campuses. And as a consequence, what started calling itself the left was a group of individuals that were concerned mostly with theories of freedom that didn't necessarily contradict regular capitalist ideology. Right. So it's all about self-fulfillment and, challenging conservative assumptions about human nature and institutions and these sort of things. And they were so alienating to working people that, if you're a working class factory worker and some college student invites you to a meeting that's ostensibly a communist party, and they're going on about the rights of transsexuals having access to whatever bathroom they want. I mean, these sort of concerns don't interest you. They're not bread and butter issues, and you're going to turn away from them because they're of no concern to you. So I'm not saying necessarily that the government orchestrated all of this, but what I am saying is that the views of certain figures around that time period sort of overtook the left as it was in the United States, and it's never recovered. It's never gotten back to its basics. It's never been able to connect with working people since then.
You make an interesting point there, actually. Sorry to interrupt you there. Just in terms of that, so like with the left, they sort of they remodeled it almost, like if you could think of like how like the structure of like people going into education, they get adopted. Okay, you want to join the left? Let's talk about these rights and stuff like that. We'll look at like the softy approach of things. And then on the right, they just turned it into this a little bit more of a bigoted, you're like this old racist old man sort of thing. Maybe they both had some points which were fairly valid, but they just turned them into like an extreme, like took the weirdest aspect of them and then and then turned it into that. So the middle could look like the most normal kind of people and the people that you probably would want as your representation. But the actual other political ideologies just look like basically weirdos after a while.
Yeah, exactly. They're the fringes of society. They're losers, or they're just not like us in some sense, and they're going to remain like that. Now, of course, in academia, this sort of took off. You could make a lucrative career as a cultural critic if you wanted to. These ideas have currency in certain milieux. But in order to turn into like a potent political force, they're useless and alienating. And I can see why, because they're only addressing concerns a certain segment of the population has, a numerically insignificant section of the population. And what the far right and the far left have sort of become mirror images of each other.
Yeah.
You brought up Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. This is a different phenomena, in my opinion, and this is sort of the populist uprising against the status quo.
Right.
And that has to do with the fact that the economy hasn't recovered, that a lot of people are seeing their standard of living decline as a result. And you're seeing the early signs of a sort of ideological legitimation crisis, which is just another way of saying that the old arguments for the status quo no longer hold any currency, that people are starting to lose their confidence in establishment parties and in conventional ideas.
Sure.
So they're starting to hear out other views for once.
So would you say that, would you connect this in history sort of terms? Like, would you say that we're in this like late 1930s point in time?
Yeah, it's analogous, but the situation isn't as desperate.
Sure.
And the forces on the extreme ends of the spectrum aren't as well developed. So, I mean, Marxists have their own theory of fascism, and I think that there's elements I disagree with in it, but there's also a very uncontroversial notion, and I think even you might agree with it. So if you look at, say, Italy or Germany in the 1920s, or after the First World War in any case, there were very well-developed communist organizations in both countries. In Italy, they had 2 years. They call it the Biennio Rosso. And that was after the First World War, when there were large-scale uprisings of working people. They were occupying factories. Communists were being elected into the Italian parliament. It was a very desperate situation from the perspective of capitalists and also in the remnants of the aristocracy that were still in existence. So they panicked, and Mussolini, who had been a Marxist once upon a time, sort of capitalized on that. Then he said, look, we can restore order. We can respect your property rights. You just need to give us the authority to do so. And that's what happened. In Germany, it was an analogous situation. There was a revolution in Munich. There were, workers' councils that had taken over. There was a very strong communist movement that emerged. That was all suppressed before Hitler took power. But the situation in Germany was still desperate. They had hyperinflation after the war.
Yep.
People were becoming increasingly destitute and angry. And Hitler sort of took advantage of that. I don't want to make comparisons. I don't think Donald Trump is a fascist at all. And I don't think that Bernie Sanders is a socialist either, even though he considers himself one.
Sure.
But they're sort of, it's analogous, but as I said, the situation isn't as desperate. There isn't this potent left-wing force that's really scaring the status quo into supporting radical solutions right now.
Yes.
So really, I just see this as people entertaining views that were previously not considered.
Sure. I like the statement. I think this is Mark Twain that made this. History doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes.
Yeah, I like that. And Marx has a good quote as well, where he says that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Okay, so I want to try and accelerate us way into the future now, because I think that'll keep us on the topic. So let's just say that we're in this scenario now. So we're tailing into this point where the debt crisis gets a little bit worse. The stock market starts to get hit again because the corporations are not making the profits, because basically there ain't any profits to be made anymore because everybody's indebted so much. So more quantitative easing goes in. There's more debt expanding into the cycle. So people have the corporate league have more money to do share buybacks, which doesn't really do anything for the production of the companies itself. This, in essence, destroys the purchasing power of the people. So they have their US dollar and they're going, hold on a minute here. My loaf of bread's going to cost me double next week. This is getting ridiculous now. So it's turning into the hype. Well, basically, we're having the deflationary side where the asset prices are depreciating quite rapidly now because nobody can afford to keep them propped up, like houses and cars and things like that. So we're in this deflationary cycle. However, it's going to get to a point where the purchasing power of the people is going to be really ripped apart, and then it goes into the inflationary, hyperinflationary stage. We sort of see that in food prices a little bit, because food prices seem to be a little bit more sensitive than like just your ridiculous assets like your yacht and things like that. But we get into that cycle. What do people do in this situation? What is the option? Do they just call in the extremist parties now and hope for the best, or do they disconnect from the government system? What's your opinion in this situation?
Well, the way I see it unfolding is, given the theory of value that I adhere to, I don't think that an inflationary period is going to commence in this scenario. I think what we're going to see instead is a deflationary cycle, and the process of that unfolding, to the extent that it's allowed to, will reestablish a decent rate of profit, in which case you'll start seeing an economic recovery. Now, how this plays out exactly is unknown. I see it being very difficult. I think that the amount of unemployment it's going to cause and the amount of savings it's going to wipe out for a lot of people is going to be politically destabilizing. And there may be a power vacuum that emerges as a result because people are going to lose confidence in the government. What happens in these situations is people don't have a perspective where they see the locus of the issue and the mode of production. Instead, they start blaming politicians because they think that politicians control how the economy operates. This is, again, another, popular misconception.
Sure.
So they're going to turn against the government. And in that case, there's no telling what forces are going to be empowered. As I said, I don't have a lot of faith in the left at this current juncture. And that's hard for me to say as a leftist. I'm doing what I can to try to rectify that. If there was a well-organized and capable left in existence, it would be able to educate the masses into understanding why this was happening and how to get out of it. But since that doesn't exist, I think what we're going to see is more of the Donald Trump populist right phenomena. And I think that we maybe not this election cycle, but perhaps the one after that, somebody like Donald Trump may be elected. He'll implement protectionist policies that are going to fail because as a Marxist, I think that protectionism distorts vital information in the global economy.
And obviously it will stop the free trade as well. And
that's right.
Adam Smith theory is going to get destroyed at that point.
Right. When it comes to trade, I have some disagreements with elements of Adam Smith. I do think that protectionist policies did help develop certain countries early on. But I also think that the information that's concealed by virtue of protectionist policy, especially in terms of productivity and efficiency, eventually leads to more distortions than whatever benefits might accrue as a consequence of these policies. And eventually you're going to have a problem emerge as a result of that.
Michael, I'm sorry, mate, I've just got a couple of things. Sorry. So firstly, I'm going to go back to your argument of deflation. But one other thing I just wanted to mention here. Say in the situation where we are workers and we own the means of production, would you say we would have our own little bit of protectionism which would occur on a micro scale for the organization? Because say we own the means of production, even though we both know that we could potentially make more profit if we outsourced it to another nation or something like that, because we know that this is our livelihood, we're not going to give it up, are we?
No, we wouldn't. And in the example you present, you still have categories such as profit. And that makes me think of, say, a workers' cooperative, which exists now in market economies, where workers literally own the means of production. They each have a share in it. Obviously, the incentive is to keep your job. So even though you're sharing profit out equally, you wouldn't be able to outsource your job.
So there's innate protectionism in that system.
Yeah,
in
there
itself.
is. In the firm itself, absolutely.
Yeah, just for self-interest, really, in a way.
Yeah, of course.
And you made just a case that there would be deflation only. Can I put a case to you why I think there might be hyperinflation?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with deflation, it's like the government's worst enemy, because once you have deflation, that means that they basically have to do deficit spending. So they have to ensure that they've got very low interest rates to afford all of the debt that they have. Now, once you have a cycle of deflation, that means that all of their debts are going to turn more expensive on them. because I'm trying to get my head around the maths of this, but basically, I've made these arguments before, but basically, once you have a debt spiral on your hands and people can, basically prices of goods become less expensive as time goes on, but they have whole debt, it's harder for the GDP to increase. So basically, they need production, basically, this economic measure, just to pay down their all of their debt. And the only way they could do that is to increase inflation, and that basically mitigates their debt by the people just having more of their own coins to wash away their own deficit. So that's why I think governments are always geared to inflate rather than to ever let it deflate, because once all of this debt that they possess turns into a deflationary cycle, then they're going to be basically wiped out, and they don't have the means to even tax people because they can't afford it, sort of thing. Now, on a corporation level, you've got a lot of corporations work by the means of capital raising. So they purchase capital assets, they might buy a football team, whatever they do. And because we work in an inflationary environment, you just take a few more years and then you can resell it, and then you make the capital gains. Maybe you're not even looking at the production of it, but we just look at this fascistic sort of valuation of the asset. And because the valuation of the asset, maybe the stock price, whatever else, has inflated, they make the profit from that. So from the government's own situation of inflating the whole system, the capitalist system, well, it's not really capitalist, but this sort of cortocracy, I can't say my language is not working for my vocabulary, is not working for me this morning, but the cortocracy, can you say that for me?
Corporatocracy?
Yes, it's I would say it's more like that. Is sort of killing itself off by the fact that it needs to essentially always inflate. It's inflate, and there isn't any way to step off the pedal at all here other than them to destroy the spending power. So a true deflation situation would be quite good, really. But I don't think the governments are ever going to agree to it, and the lobbyists are never going to agree to it. It's inflate or they basically kill themselves off. Not kill themselves off, but they basically destroy the means of their ability to organize.
I see the logic in your argument. I think where we disagree is on some of our assumptions.
Sure.
So I agree that within that perspective, it's a perfectly rational view to hold. My problem comes down to the theory of inflation itself. And this sort of, I think the reason why we disagree on this is because I'm basing my views off of different assumptions, and it's grounded in the labor theory of value, and that has effects for prices. So my theory of inflation is going to differ. Obviously, governments are always inflating on a very low level. But when it comes to hyperinflation, I think that's where you and I have a disagreement on the causes of it. I see that, obviously governments are printing money right now like it's going out of style, but you haven't seen a corresponding increase in ordinary prices. You see it a little bit here and there, as you said, on food, but not nearly to the extent you would think, given the amount of printing of money that's occurred in the last 5 years.
It seems to be held in like the stocks and stuff like that. That's where the inflation's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the problem is the Federal Reserve is tasked in this country with monitoring inflation. And they've done a really good job thus far at mitigating it, even though they are printing a lot of money. And one of the reasons we haven't seen hyperinflation is because even though banks are getting, they're getting money at very low interest rates, they're not loaning it out. They're acting very conservatively because the climate is so bad. and you're not seeing that circulation of money that you would expect given the amount of currency that's been amount of money that's been pressed.
Sure.
I think that when you see inflation most clearly is when you start seeing wage hikes across the economy. That's when, say the government increased the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Right. Then you would see corresponding inflation, and it would be significant. But in terms of, a crisis that culminates in hyperinflation, as I said, I think that the deflationary spiral would be sufficient to restore profitability and result in an economic recovery after that. I don't think we would get to the point where you'd have a hyperinflation. And if you look historically, like at the period in Weimar Germany, for instance, in the 1920s, where they had hyperinflation, yep. That was a consequence of the debts that were leveled on Germany after the First World War. So the government was printing a lot of Deutschmarks or whatever their currency was because they were paying off war debts to their allied governments, and that had a deleterious effect on the rest of the economy.
Okay,
because they were
just so I understand your side. So, do you think that the governments will manage their fiscal policy to an extent of lowering their debts by inflating the system, but then not taking it too far and just trying to balance the act a little bit afterwards?
I don't think they're going to be able to manage their debts until we enter a period of economic recovery. I think you'll see an increase in the public debt, but that's as a consequence of unemployment and not being able to collect tax revenue. It's just a symptom of the economy itself doing so poorly. Like they can't bring in the revenue to pay down those debts that they've accrued. I don't know if that's going to result in the United States. We're in a unique position because we're sort of like the reserve currency for the world. We're in a privileged position here. So sure. Our national debt isn't quite as catastrophic as debts in more peripheral countries. So it's hard to say how that plays out here versus, say, Japan. But I don't think they're going to the public debt is going to increase until the fundamentals of the economy have recovered. But I don't think it's going to result in a hyperinflation.
Okay, so from my side, I would say that I believe that the size and the scale of the debt is incredible. And from my perspective, the thing that they're doing is quantitative easing. They're actually purchasing bonds to buy back their own debt. Mm-hmm. So basically, they're creating this model where they're actually just like using their credit card to pay down their own debt, which is sort of defeating the whole object sort of thing. And this is all based upon the ability to just keep the expense of their deficit down. They have to use this quantitative easing method just to keep it lower. Now, they're not actually properly pricing it in accordance to what the market believes, not what the bond traders believe. They're actually sort of taking it over, as I say, and actually making this sort of fake version of how much debt they're actually being charged at the moment. But there's certain situations in terms of like the petrodollar and how much debt the Chinese owe and things like that. And every country has to have a certain amount of US dollars. It's the flight to safety currency, and say if you want to buy any oil or trade in certain ways, you need to have certain reserves of the US dollar. Now, in a political crisis and things like that, say if Donald Trump comes to power and they say, look, we're not going to pay you back for all of these bonds, and China knows that the US is actually devaluing the actual value of their bonds in itself, then China could say, okay, well, sod you, I'm going to dump my bonds onto the market. And that could put further pressure back on the US And if nobody's purchasing these bonds, which they're already like creating a fake market by they're purchasing it for themselves, then you've got a situation where they have to increase their quantitative easing even further. And then that should, in theory, really start to whack the US dollar into a bit of a situation. Now, everyone thinks that the US dollar is the flight to safety. However, what's underpinning it, what's the maths of the size of the debt that the US has, is a mega problem in itself. And that this is where my theory lies, and I sort of stick with a lot of Austrian economists on this side.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. There are a lot of contingent factors that you specified there, and that could certainly happen. I just don't think that, for instance, China is going to go that route. And the reason being is because the United States and Chinese have such a symbiotic mutual dependence on one another that it wouldn't be in China's interest to do that. And I know that they are leading in terms of buying our bonds at the moment, and they have been for years.
I think they're just starting to lower that a little bit recently, but yeah, I think you're right in terms of they're the biggest bond purchaser.
Yeah, I may be right. It's been a long time since I reviewed a lot of this data.
Sure.
But in any event, China is a export-driven economy, and the United States has been its principal consumer. And part of the reason is because we've exported a lot of jobs overseas to China. They're sort of the international workhouse, as it were. But we're still the primary consumer. I mean, obviously, Australia, you guys do a lot of exporting to China in terms of raw materials. And I know Europe is also a major purchaser of Chinese goods, but the United States is its principal trading partner. That has been fueled for years based off of private debt, because one of the consequences of firms moving overseas, especially in manufacturing, is that the work we have available here is increasingly in the service sector. It's not as well paid as it once was, and a lot of this consumption is debt driven. But the problem is China has not developed its own internal market to the point where they could risk jeopardizing American consumption.
Sure.
If they had developed an adequate national market where they could sort of transition into a domestic consumption sort of economy, then they'd have the ability to engage in the sort of geopolitical maneuvering you had specified. But right now, I don't think they can, and I don't think they will for the foreseeable future.
What about your opinion of the rise of nationalism? Do you think that's, because with nationalism, there's a little bit of an element of racism as well. Do you think we've got too much of a mixture of society? It's too much of a cultural mix of society that should happen? Or do you think that is actually maybe the cause of it, or things like that?
Well, this is one area where I sort of diverge from classical Marxism, and it's because Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels never left an adequate theory of nationality.
Sure.
There were other Marxists who developed very convincing theories. Personally, I think that Otto Bauer, Moses Hess, James Connolly, people like that had all contributed very persuasive theories to the national question. I personally believe that national identity is an innate human attribute. It sort of extends from our tribal history.
Sure.
But I think that it's relatively innocuous. I don't think that it's necessarily racist, or I think that it can be instrumentalized to be. And I think that what we're witnessing now is a lot of right-wing parties taking that natural human inclination to identify on a national level and sort of weaponizing it. So what you'll have is you'll start seeing racist sentiments increase. And I think that's part of the contradictions of capital as well. I think that the structural imperative to minimize labor costs precipitated international waves of immigration that have just been haphazardly implemented in destructive ways. So in Europe, for instance, you see nationalist sentiments increasing in proportion to the amount of Muslim immigrants. And not just Muslim. If you look at the case of the UK, this recent Brexit vote,
Yep.
there's a lot of Eastern European immigration, and that has jeopardized the standing of the British working class in a lot of ways, because you have these workers flooding the labor market, putting downward pressure on wages, and, right-wing parties can take advantage of that. Left-wing parties could also take advantage of it, but they don't.
Sure.
So what you see instead is, increase in racist attacks, some animosities between populations. And I do see that increasing in the United States and in Europe. I don't think that the conditions are such that we'll see a reversal anytime soon.
Interesting, because I think we can merge this one as well with the environment and scarcity. So
Yes.
as resources become more scarce, this planet is finite, and the access of certain materials is getting harder and harder. People are going, okay, well, I've only got this much now, and these guys have come into town and they're taking my resources. So it comes into that very sort of basic human instinct sort of side of things, and it's tribalism almost, isn't it? Where you go, okay, well, they're going to be killing the same sort of animals that we're trying to kill in this area. So what's going on here? This is unfair, and I think this brings out the primeval sort of instincts in people. Because of the environmental destruction, there isn't the focus on sustainability, which capitalism sort of does like to destruct a little bit sometimes with the environment a little bit. The costs of this is a bit of a tricky part with the environment with capitalism, because they will try to provide the cheapest good possible for the person to consume, rather than not facing a more holistic approach of what is the social good of that product as well. Like, is there any problems that are going to occur? It might just focus purely on the transaction which occurs, not what happens outside of that transaction.
Yeah, that has always been a serious situation in capitalism.
And the spanning of that is potentially racism, environmental catastrophe, all of those kind of things span off that individual transaction, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you have conditions of scarcity, and especially within a competitive environment, as capitalism is, you have something like a Hobbesian war of all against all. And that's when racism and xenophobia are really palpable, because they're easy signifiers and you can form allegiances based off of them, especially in competitive struggles. And when you have immigrants, obviously, people are going to latch on to those sort of things. But capitalism, it does have this
disconnect, isn't it? It's disconnect.
It's a disconnect. And it's because there's this structural imperative to grow. The economy has to grow, otherwise you fall into recession. And all of our goods and services, eventually they stem from, if you go back enough, to natural resources. And as you said, we live in a finite planet, and this is a serious problem. Capitalism also, as you had alluded to, sometimes it misprices goods and services because it's just based upon the interaction of the consumer and the seller. And it doesn't take into account the broader societal consequences. So, gas might be $2.30 a gallon at the time, but CO2 emissions are such that it's going to take a lot of social investment to rectify the ecological consequences that emerge therefrom. So it's problematic.
This is a very broad subject. So I think I was going to add a few other arguments on this, but I think we might leave that to another episode in the future. I'm getting a little bit concerned that we might be running out of time very shortly. Is there anything else that you'd like to just mention, just to encapsulate or frame the episode that we've just had, or is there anything else that we've missed that you'd like to add to this?
I mean, I'm pleasantly surprised at how much we are in agreement and our views correspond to one another.
Sure.
I'm sure that I didn't adequately convey some of your questions. I'm such right now that I've been working very daunting hours, and I'm not as articulate as I otherwise would be. But nonetheless, I feel like unless you disagree, I feel that I was coherent enough that you could get an appreciation from my perspective on a lot of this.
Yeah, no. I thought everything's gone very well indeed. And we're going to have more episodes anyway, so we can definitely string out my side and we can string out your side a little bit more. We tackled a few tiny little debates here and there, but as we're just working on the future, I think I knew that there would be a lot of consensus between us both. But we're going to probably go a little bit more into detail for the next episode, and I think we'll probably go a bit more interesting at that point. And I think any listeners are going to find those episodes very interesting, because that's where we're going to find we're going to go into probably more philosophical arguments, I would say, going into the future. But that's that we'll leave that for another time and for people to look forward to anyway. Just from my side, I thought that was great. I think I'm sounding a little bit more like a Marxist, my side, with a lot of the arguments that I make. But it's funny how sometimes things can be so quite similar, and then sometimes quite different at the same time. But it's interesting just to draw comparisons anyway for the start, and then we can just sort of divert. And really, I mean, my sort of principle is it's not necessarily just like you shouldn't really just be caught up with just one domain of thinking. Always take different aspects. If you can look into Marxism, I think it's a fantastic area to look into. Maybe you don't agree with it, but I think there's just so much to learn from it, just to gain knowledge. And if you're a Marxist, I definitely recommend looking into capitalism, Austrian economics. I think there's just some fantastic arguments, and if you can rationalize them and get to the logic of those points, I think it's for the good of everyone.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I always think that no matter where your biases may lie, you benefit by looking at the most the most powerful objections to your point of view, because it's easy to dismiss lousy objections to your political philosophy. And humans, so we have a sort of innate tendency towards confirmation bias. We only look at sources that reaffirm what we already think, but you don't really cultivate yourself as an individual intellectually by doing that. Yeah, it's essential that you hear the most powerful counter arguments to your viewpoints, and if your views can withstand that kind of criticism, then it's good. You'll have more confidence in what you believe in. I've always been of that persuasion, and that's why I studied Austrian economics. I've looked into classical political economy, and I've learned a lot from that. And I think that even if you're not persuaded by what you know of Marxism at the moment, and this is for listeners in particular, it's worth looking into and giving it a charitable reading, because even if you're as you said, Charles, even if they're ultimately not persuaded, they may nevertheless have gained some insights they otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's a great area to end us on there. So thank you very much, Michael. Are you definitely going to come back?
Oh yeah, absolutely, anytime. And especially you and I, we diverged on the issue of inflation, and I don't know how coherent I was being on that point in particular, but I think that stems from differences in terms of the theory of value you and I subscribe to, and we'd really only be able to flesh that out through a more comprehensive discussion on that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, definitely. I think we'll have a few discussions as to where we want to approach the next topics for the next episode. But we'll expand on your theory, and I'll definitely make sure that you are well clarified. Even if you might think that there were certain areas that weren't necessarily explained from your side, or I don't think some of my arguments were that great either. But just we'll expand on it, so we'll give you plenty of time just to make sure that your record is straight.
All right, excellent.
So yeah, thank you very much for your time. We will be in contact very shortly in the future. Hopefully, this episode will go out at the end of this week. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
Cheers, mate. Okay. Yeah, I'll speak to you soon.